In this episode of Through the Scarlett Lens, we consider the United Nations, an organisation which has power without enforcement. When people hear the words United Nations, they often think of blue helmets, speeches in New York, or endless meetings that seem to lead nowhere. Some see the UN as essential. Others see it as weak or irrelevant. To understand which of those views makes the most sense, we need to go back to why the UN exists in the first place. And to do that, we need to start with its failed predecessor, the League of Nations, a good idea with no teeth. After the First World War, the world was traumatized. Tens of millions were dead. Entire regions had been destroyed. Empires had collapsed. New borders had been drawn quickly and badly. The big question was simple. How do we stop this happening again? The answers many leaders came up with was cooperation. If countries talked to each other, settled disputes peacefully, and agreed that aggression would not be tolerated, then maybe war could be avoided. The idea became the League of Nations, founded in 1920. On paper, it sounded sensible. Countries would meet, debate problems, and resolve disputes before they turned violent. The problem was power. The League had no army. It could not force countries to obey its decisions. Even worse, some of the powerful countries of the world were not even fully committed. The United States never joined. Others ignored the League when it suited them. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, this weakness became obvious. When Japan invaded Manchuria, the League complained, but Japan stayed. When Italy invaded Ethiopia, sanctions were applied half-heartedly. When Germany began tearing up treaties and expanding its borders, the League issued warnings and reports. It could talk, it could condemn, it could not stop anything. By the time Adolf Hitler became openly expanding Nazi Germany, the League had lost all credibility. When the Second World War broke out in 1939, the League of Nations was effectively finished. The lesson was clear. An international organisation without power is easily ignored. Learning from failure, the birth of the United Nations. When the Second World War ended, the devastation was even worse than before. Cities destroyed, millions of people dead. Genocide exposed the darkest side of human behaviour. But the idea of cooperation was not abandoned. Instead, it was redesigned. In 1945, the United Nations was created. At the time, the designers of the system tried to be realistic. They accepted that powers mattered. Instead of pretending all countries were equal, they built power into the system. That is why the Security Council exists, with 5 permanent members: the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, France, and China. These countries were given veto powers because the logic was simple. If you want to have powerful states obey the rule of law, you have to give them a stake in writing them. This made the UN more realistic than the League. It also made it unequal. But the UN had something the League never achieved: near universal membership. Today, almost every country in the world belongs to the United Nations. Very few are excluded. This gives it enormous legitimacy. When the UN speaks, it speaks for almost the entire world. What the UN actually does well. It's easy to criticise the United Nations for what it fails to do. But before that, it's important to recognise what it has achieved. The UN has shaped how the world thinks about human dignity. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights did not magically end abuse, but it set a global standard. Governments could no longer pretend that brutality was acceptable. Agreements on refugees, genocide, women's rights, and children's rights flowed from this system. The Convention on the Rights of the Child, for example, transforms how childhood is understood and protected across most of the world. Then there are the UN agencies. The World Health Organization has coordinated global responses to disease, helped eradicate smallpox, and built early warning systems for outbreaks. UNICEF has saved millions of children through vaccination, nutrition, education, and clean water programs. UNESCO has protected cultural heritage and promoted education worldwide. These are not abstract achievements, they are practical. They affect everyday life. So the UN is not useless, far from it. But power is about more than influence. The core weakness: power without enforcement. Here is the central problem. The United Nations can pass resolutions, it can issue reports, it can condemn actions, but it cannot force countries to comply unless those countries agree. This is true across the system. Sanctions only work if countries enforce them. Human rights only matter if governments respect them. International law only works when states choose to follow it. The UN does not have its own army. It relies on member states. Even UN peacekeeping forces are limited. They are usually sent in with permission. Their job is often to observe, monitor, and not to fight. Sometimes this works. Sometimes it prevents violence from escalating. Sometimes it fails catastrophically. Rwanda, when the system broke down. The genocide in Rwanda in 1994 is the clearest example of this failure. As mass killings began, UN peacekeepers were already in the country. They had information, they knew what was happening, but they did not have the mandate, resources, or political backing to act. Instead of reinforcing the mission, the international community pulled back. In about 100 days, roughly 800,000 people were murdered. This was not because the UN did not know, it was because the powerful countries decided not to intervene. The UN could not act without them. Rwanda showed the limits of international morality when it clashes with political convenience. The Security Council is a problem. Much of this comes back to the Security Council. The 5 permanent members can veto any resolution. This means actions can be blocked even when the majority of the world agrees. It also means powerful countries pick and choose. They may support humanitarian agencies but ignore human rights rulings. They may promote international law but bypass it when it becomes inconvenient. The UN depends upon the same states it is meant to restrain. Iraq, when the rules were ignored. The 2003 invasion of Iraq made this painfully obvious. The United Nations sent inspectors to look for weapons of mass destruction. They did not find any. The Security Council did not authorize war. But war happened anyway, led by the United States and the United Kingdom. The UN objected, it debated, it warned. It could not stop it. The moment damaged the UN's credibility, not because it was wrong, but because it was powerless. What the United Nations really is. The United Nations is not a world government. It is a former, a coordinator, a standard setter, a mirror of global power. When countries cooperate, it works well. When they do not, it stalls.